event, we had Marcus Strom, who is, he's a science journalist, but he's also, he was also representing the MEAA, which is the Media, Entertainment and Arts Association. So they're a union for media, entertainment and arts, and recognising that almost everything we do as science communicators fits into media, entertainment and arts. Definitely those of us who have a public audience, any public, I mean. And yeah, and we also had Matt Nurse, who is actually mid-research project looking at how much science communication skills are worth and valued at in Australia and what Cycom jobs look like. So we had a lot of great discussions there about how much everyone thought their time was worth, about the different scenarios as well, recognising some people are full-time research scientists and they see, you know, communicating their science that they have expertise in as part of the role of getting public funding and as part of their role, sometimes within their university and beyond, whilst others, you know, have their full-time job and do Cycom on the side, whereas, you know, there are event organisers who engage with other people, whether that's volunteer or whether they're paying them. So there were lots of different angles to come at this question. And so I just really wanted to kick off from that as well in this discussion. So these are, you might notice some similarities between these two lists, the things I've learned the hard way, as well as the things I haven't learned yet at all, because I think all of those things are things that I still struggle with, things that I think I might be nailing, and then something happens to make me go, oh, I didn't even consider that. So I definitely think this is a work in progress, and I'm constantly learning and relearning everything, and it definitely varies each gig, each time. So the big questions that I'll pose throughout might be ones you want to ponder, whether that's something you have an answer for you in this space right now, or whether it's something you want to take away and think more about. What does all this mean for you? So I thought I'd try and talk about some of the things that I've learned. And yes, the disclaimer is this advice must be consumed with a grain of salt, because just as I've gotten advice from others, you know, we all have our own context for what we're doing and who we're engaging with and why, and what our own financial circumstances are, what our own industries are, the types of work we're engaging with and what's standard. So just take that in note. But this is if you're asking someone to Cycom for you. So I suppose the scenario I was thinking about was all the times I've been asked to kind of do something where it's around an event. Event organisers have asked me to speak at an event or MC or moderate a panel or something like that. But this is also stuff that kind of applies to other types of gigs. I've had like people talking to me about whether I would like to host a series of videos or do voiceovers for them or write an article, those sorts of things. So my advice would be, if we could as a community, let people know up front whether we are asking them to volunteer their time. Some of my favourite requests to Cycom haven't even been the ones where they've been like, hey, Lee, we have money to pay you. It's been sometimes just people and organisations who've been really transparent up front about the fact that they are asking you to volunteer your time. And one of the reasons for that is it really exemplifies that they know that your time is worth something, even if they don't have funds. And sometimes that's also been like, you know, we're not charging for this event, we're all volunteers, etc., etc. Sometimes, you know, people want you to volunteer your time, but they're actually a for-profit organisation. It's a for-profit event. Everyone's paying a ticket fee and they're paying the videographer to film the event, but not you as the person they're filming. And that's something else entirely. If you are asking for a quote, say from the start, that makes it a big difference. Like we would be, even if you don't want to go into details until they've actually accepted or until you're actually sure that they're willing to go down that path, just say up front, you know, we'd be happy to offer a quote and give you more details as needed to provide that, or we're willing to pay you for our time. Or if you have if you're willing to, and I know this differs case to case, you might just be like, look, we know this probably isn't your fee, but this is the fee we have. And we understand if you say no, I guess. So don't make them dig for it. So many emails would be cut down from people having to like try and determine if they're being asked to give up their time for free or not. And I don't have a blanket yes or no to that. That doesn't mean I'm going to cut people off just because they don't have funding to pay for my time. Having said that, sometimes I might need to say, actually, I don't have any more capacity to do more stuff because I've already said yes to a lot of stuff this month. So outline how this may be of mutual benefit. I think when we are engaging with other people to be part of our Cycom events and their volunteering, we can have more creative discussions about what might make it mutually beneficial. It can't be one way, you know, and I know that we can't work for free for exposure, but potentially that is something they're interested in. Is there something they'd be interested in learning more about that's someone else's role that you could get them to shadow? You know, are there some skills that you have that you might just say, hey, I'd be happy to do like some graphic design for you, or I'd be happy to like, you know, help you with your website or whatever it is. Like you can kind of help each other if you are in that scenario where you don't have budget and you are asking people to volunteer. So yeah, having an open conversation, asking for their suggestions, questions, things like that are really important. And being clear about the time commitment, whether someone's being paid or not. I think it's really important to be clear about the time commitment. And sometimes I have only thought about the time commitment of the event and been like, yes, I've got time to do that. And then I haven't really been made aware or haven't asked, and it's definitely a two-way street. Like, oh, they want me to do a rehearsal for that event. Oh, they actually want me to be present at several meetings before the event. Oh, they want me to write all this material for the event. Oh, they like, all those things are important to know to make your yeses count, or to even renegotiate your yes so that you make sure both parties know like what everyone's doing. Be clear about things like whether parking, travel, accommodation, food would be self-funded. I think early on I was just so excited about even free opportunities that often I ended up just adding up things like parking or things like little things that I had to pay for that, and ended up being like, actually, it's not even me just giving up my time for free. It's me like actually paying a lot of money sometimes. And do some research onto the person you invite. Like, I'm really sad I have to say this, but I've been invited to do things sometimes by people who seem really enthusiastic to work with me. And then when I talk to them, they make it really clear that from our discussion that they actually have no idea who I am or what I do or where I'm based or what kind of work I've been up to for the past few years. And that's really disappointing. And that doesn't mean you have to do lots of research. Maybe just like have a browse of the LinkedIn of someone you're going to invite, or their website if they've got one or something like that. And regardless of their answer, be polite. I think sometimes freelancers have problems where they say no to something, and you know, they might be like saying no because they can't afford to take on free work, they can't afford to volunteer. That's fine. You need to respect people's boundaries, whether it's just not the sort of opportunity they're interested in or whether it's just something that they can't afford to do for free. Yeah, I think that's important to think of. So another big question you might want to start asking yourself is, how much should I charge for what I do? If you were to go freelance, would your hourly rate, if you're currently being paid to do Cycom in some sort of, you know, on some sort of wage, would your hourly rate be enough as a freelancer? You know, what would you charge for what you do? What would you pay someone else for what they do? And how much does that actually align with the reality of how much their skills and time are worth? Are you paying just for their time, or for the fact that there's someone with 3 decades of experience in that thing and can do it in a lot less time than someone else? So this is the other side of the thing. If someone is asking you to Cycom for them, yeah, I say, if I'm clear before accepting an invitation, I always ask whether someone's offering to pay for my time or if they're asking me to volunteer. I still ask all the questions, or try to. Although sometimes I still get caught out, sometimes just being like, oh, I know what this event is. And then later on being like, oh, I didn't actually clarify that. So that's what I mean when I said earlier, the things that I've learned the hard way are still the things that I'm still learning now very much. Sometimes you might think they want to work with you, but they're actually asking multiple people for quotes and then kind of playing those off against each other. So it's good to be aware of that. You know, the first time that happened to me, I was like, oh, what happened? That organization asked me to host a podcast for them. I sent them a quote and said, by the way, like, I know COVID's impacted your organization. Just know these are my rates, but I'm happy to negotiate within your budget because, you know, just trying to be empathetic. And then they never got back to me. And then I saw someone else doing it and I was like, what? And then I got back in touch with feedback and they just said, oh, I thought you would have realized that yours was one of a few quotes that we were getting, and that person just, you know, they had lower rates. And I was like, oh. But it's also another reason why we have to be aware when we're working in spaces of how much each other are charging for our time, because sometimes I've found that people who do Cycom more as something they do for fun on the side are almost charging nothing or nothing at all. And actually that ends up devaluing everyone's work, which is something media, entertainment, and arts are always talking about. And we should definitely see ourselves as part of that conversation, in my view. Yeah, so think about how much your time's worth and also how that might vary in terms of different types of work. So there's writing, there's emceeing, there's outreach. You know, some of you are running workshops for different types of audiences, and different types of client as well. I've realized that sometimes something is a really good rate if working for a non-profit, or something is a good rate for working with a commercial, like a big commercial company. And something's just not an affordable rate if you're working with a small not-for-profit. So I think it's important to think about those sorts of things as well, and definitely thinking about that when it comes to whether it's something you're willing to volunteer your time for too. Because if you look at the client and they're a huge commercial for-profit company running a for-profit event and asking you to volunteer your time, you might have some questions to ask, and you'll know that you actually have a case to put forward for why you should be paid. I mean, you shouldn't have to put a case forward, but it seems like in Australia before the pandemic you had to, let alone now. I'd say join your union, MEAA. If you are someone who, you know, we think about ourselves as Cycommers. I've noticed a lot of people, we're too busy thinking about ourselves as scientists to actually think about ourselves as artists, creatives, media people, entertainers, people working in PR. You know, all of these things are sectors that have unions, have standard rates that we can refer to, have, you know, discussion forums on Facebook, Slack pages, all sorts of places where you can ask fellow freelancers in that space how much they charge. But in Cycom, we're so busy thinking of ourselves in relation to science researchers that I think often it's to our detriment in this sort of way. Again, another of my hot takes. So I think also when you come to thinking about how much your time is worth, I realized after talking to some other people who are freelancers in kind of the media world and things like that, they were talking about things like, okay, this is maybe what you want to be aiming to be paid, recognizing that by the time you have sporadic work, it'll be less, and the fact that no one's paying for your sick leave or annual leave, the fact that you also have to pay your own superannuation. I mean, you can get away with just never paying superannuation if you don't earn over a threshold as a sole trader, but that's not recommended because, you know, we're hopefully going to live for a long time. So really having those discussions and talking to others, and if you can afford it, even talking to an accountant or someone like that about these things is really important going in, because, you know, someone else with a full-time job who does emceeing on the side, they can probably afford to charge not very much for their services. Whereas someone like me, it's not just, it is partly because of, you know, the different experience and different skills that I can bring, but it's partly because I'm also paying for my own superannuation, because even though your event is only 1 hour long, it's taking maybe 5 or 6 hours out of that day, or if it's an overnight event, that's a whole other thing. So there's a lot of things to consider, and I think having consideration of that from both ends will hopefully lead us to come to have better negotiations, because it's not about demanding that you want every single box to be ticked. I mean, some of us are like, I'm sure, you know, maybe Dr. Carl can do that, but there's always a negotiation for most of us when it comes to those things between the two parties. Yeah, and consider what makes something a yes and no for you is another thing I would say. So that can be different depending on who you are and what your circumstance is. The first one, pay, might be the only thing that makes it worth a yes for you because of your circumstances, and that is legitimate. You know, inequity is a thing. Financial inequity, definitely a thing. In 2020, even more of a thing for more people. Prestige and passion and pay, some people say you need all three or at least two, but honestly, if it's just one of them and that's pay, go for it. It might be something to do with your strategic goal for your career. You don't have to have the same rule for everything, but definitely sitting down and thinking about what makes it worth a yes and a no, time-wise, what you learn from the experience, you know, what opportunities it brings to you in your career, your enjoyment of it. You know, some things might be full of prestige and lots of pay and would be strategic for your career, but you've just got no passion for it. And that might be fine for you to say yes, or it might be a reason for you to say no. That's very much up to you. And ask for an offer feedback post events as well is something I would recommend. And consider who or what are both negotiating and compromising for versus what you won't compromise on. I just saw someone ask a question. You mentioned a few standards for fees. Is this something that unions publicly show people to reference? Yes, MEAA has a bunch of different standard fees for lots of different media, entertainment and arts gigs. No, they don't encompass all of the things that will be Cycommers, and maybe that's something as a Cycom community we need to think about. Maybe we need to think about whether we need to make our own standards for our membership as ASC. Or maybe that's something we need to partner with a union like MEAA on to find out, you know, what rates they already have that are relevant to the members of ASC, and what other types of guidance we might be able to provide people who do Cycom work in Australia, whether they're a member or not, because I think it benefits us all. So that person says, for context, I grew up overseas in a country without widely used unions, so I'm still getting to know what unions actually do. The other thing that unions do, I guess, if their member base is big enough, is they can advocate for fair work environments, safe work environments, fair pay as a group, which means they have more collective power, I think, than individually. So the standard fees are difficult for science communicators to find, I think, because the types of clients we're working with aren't necessarily the same as all types of freelancers. The types of work aren't necessarily the same, but I do think that we should be looking to professionals in lots of different spaces to find those fees, because it very much varies whether you are someone doing Cycom on social media as more of an influencer, or whether you're someone who's doing something that's more aligned with PR and marketing. There are unions, there are rates, there are fees, there are professional networking events. Yeah, you just sometimes have to go out of your way. So how do we ensure Cycom is valued? I think this is one of the things that ASC, the Australian Science Communicators, is for at the end of the day. And I think we really need to think about the impact of free labour. We really need to think about a lot of different things. So I'm just going to bust a bunch of questions out there, and then we'll go to Q&A and and it'll be a good time. So we need to think about how we engage with Cycommers, how we budget. So if we're doing a grant application for National Science Week, are we putting in our ideal budget paying for Cycommers, or are we paying for everyone except the Cycommer? And if so, what's the impact that has on the industry? Could we do the same thing but move our numbers around? Or if we just put those people's wages in there, put that one-off consulting fee or something like that for $100 or $1,000 in there for different people and different services, could that make a difference to our community? So how do we ensure we aren't undervaluing Cycom and selling our whole community short comes into that? And definitely that's a discussion that's further along when it comes to, you know, things like visual arts and journalism. And I definitely think there's a lot of discussion already happening there that we should look to when we're having that discussion within our own community. What considerations make things different depending on whether you're a research scientist, a freelancer, employed by an org or a not-for-profit? And I know that research scientists who do Cycom, while they are employed full-time as a research scientist, they will have totally different needs and totally different understandings of what they do for free and what is part of their role and not than I will. And that's totally legitimate as well. But also research scientists need to know when they step over that line into actually doing something for free that a professional science communicator should be paid to do, and whether they're actually reducing demand for Cycom skills, which doesn't help anyone. So how do we make purposeful and considered decisions around that? I guess that's what it comes down to. We can't all have lots of budget. We can't all have everyone paid heaps for everything all the time. But I think it's great for us to consider, if and when we do that, how we can make those mutually beneficial volunteering arrangements. And how we think about next year's budget. Do we ask for a quote this year in case we want to be able to budget for being able to employ someone in that space next year? You know, how do we value our own time, not just in money? And are we demonstrating that Cycom is valuable in the way we conduct ourselves and in what we ask of others, from beginners to pros? And, you know, are we talking to students about this, or people at various stages of their career about this? There's a lot to unpack. So now it's your turn, really. I want to hear from all of you. Feel free to ask me questions or pose your own answers to some of my questions. But I'll pass you over to Karina.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lee. Really, really appreciate that. As I'm giving everyone a few moments to type their questions into the Q&A box, I might just start off with one of my own. And I've, of course, just gotten the doomed "your internet connection is unstable" message. So let's see how we go. I was wondering if I could get you to speak a little bit on the idea, and I know you and I have had a few conversations on Twitter about this, but when research scientists wade into the Cycom space and are absolutely shocked to hear that Cycom is actually a discipline with journals and established norms, I suppose, and expectations. And you mentioned that this sometimes can change the perception and value of Cycom. And I was just wondering if you could just expand on that a little.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, if anyone's watching who is a research scientist, that research scientists are time poor. They're asked to do everything, whether they were trained to do it or not. And that includes things like lecturing and forming curriculum and managing budgets and applying for grants and lots of HR people management and supervision and all sorts of things that isn't the core of the research. And so I recognize that as part of the problem, as well as the publish or perish and all those things. These all come into it. And I think more and more we're seeing this kind of discussion about the value of science communication. And it's really great to see a new generation of research scientists who are thinking about themselves as science communicators and the importance of communicating their own work. But I think alongside that needs to come the discussion about the fact that, you know, this is work, and perhaps, you know, we have to have more purposeful discussions about how that work's valued when it comes to the researcher's career path and their merit and their resume and things like that. And if it is valued, you know, are we going to pay for professional science communicators to join with scientists and facilitate that? The other thing I see is that sometimes, you know, because we've got such a, well, it's great to see actually, we've got such a thriving community of research scientists who are science communicators and are doing that. But their view of the purpose and the methods of Cycom is very much shaped by the methods and the purpose for Cycom within that research space. And that's a legitimate reason to be using Cycom to inform the public or to, you know, tell people about what your research is finding. But there are also so many other legitimate purposes and means for Cycom outside of that. And I think often because research scientists are so busy with all the things in their life, they don't have time to sit down and read the multidisciplinary bodies of research that inform best practice science communication. And science communication is an umbrella term. So you would be looking through the literature in sociology, in psychology, and behavioral sciences, and you would be looking at political science, you'd be looking at gender studies, you'd be looking at race studies, you'd be looking at every type of humanities and social science, as well as, you know, those things at the crossover like psychology. And, you know, it comes into things like risk communication and doctor-patient communication, all these different things. So I think there's not necessarily some experience, if they often don't know that there are people researching the science of Cycom and that there are people researching best practice. And if they do know that, they might have only engaged with it on this general level, you know, that teaches you how to talk about your own research to a public audience. But there are more specific things we can engage with depending on your research. You know, you might want to engage with ethics and genetics and public attitudes because that's your space. You might want to engage with, you know, you might have a science that's really controversial, but you might not. You might have a science that's really difficult to understand, but it's not controversial and doesn't have any immediate public implications at least. Or people are very accepting of the outcomes. And all of those things are things that there is research that can inform. So I think there's not enough value of Cycom as a discipline as well out there. And that actually harms research scientists because people don't value their Cycom work and they don't support their Cycom work in terms of facilitating it, you know, employing people to help and things like that. And it doesn't end up being strategic. It doesn't end up having strategic outcomes for the research sector or science communication as a whole.
Brilliant. I'm just going to quickly, in case you haven't seen it down in the chat, Nancy also mentioned on the topic of accessible information on setting your own fees, that writers and editors associations often also have information about this if your Cycom is in a written format.
Yes.
That you can refer to. Yeah, and it doesn't get evaluated to see if it worked well. That is absolutely a downfall of the way that sometimes things are done out of the academy. I'm going to throw you a really big question, if I might, Lee. What do you see as some of the big changes to the role of science communication and science communicators in a post-pandemic world? I mean, not that we're quite post yet.
Yeah, I was like, I suppose we're not there yet, but I think actually the thing is what we're seeing from people's reactions to COVID is actually things that, you know, wouldn't be surprising to someone who studies things like public health and epidemiology and climate change communications, because these are all spaces that already use, you know, things that we call science communication, as well as, you know, that crossover between humanities and science. But I think perhaps now one of the opportunities I see is that as someone who's a climate communicator, I can more easily sometimes point, because it was a shorter time frame, to certain things that have happened in the public psyche around COVID and say, you know, this is a similar thing here where, you know, just because we put in these measures in place here doesn't mean we see a difference in the numbers until here. And that's the same with climate change. The lag time between acting on climate change and seeing the difference when it comes to, you know, extreme weather, for instance, is going to be longer. And so I think I'm just thinking about this as a climate communicator. There's potentially some opportunity for even more impactful discussions with people about risk and behaviour and lag times, and, you know, things that we model for as well has always been a problem in climate change, because people are like, they predicted that and then that didn't happen. But we've also been relying on models and relying on the assumptions of those models, and people have had to become more comfortable with when those assumptions are true versus not, and the fact that they're used to inform, not as a crystal ball. So that's an opportunity I see. In Australia, I think one of the, in my space, you know, in TV and film and online presenting, unfortunately, the pandemic has been a time when, you know, the government's been able to, under the guise of the pandemic, cut a lot of regulations that led to our factual documentaries and factual media being made in Australia. So none of you might have realised, because, you know, things like Craig Rucastle's 2 docos this year, you know, those were already in production and going to happen. But the government quotas, and he's in the ABC, that's the other thing, but the government quotas for the commercial networks to make factual content have been slashed this year. And it's something that's been an ongoing battle the whole time I was at Scope, because children's drama and documentary come under those quotas. And children, as in Scope and Totally Wild, which is science, communication and factual content, you know, that's also something, if those quotas don't get reinstated, that could actually, you know, risk our ability to tell factual Australian stories through television, and to have means of telling our stories in the global context too. That's definitely something that's hugely impacted the community. So I really want us to think about the arts and media and entertainment as our sector, not just what's happening to the science sector, which we communicate for and on behalf of and support a lot of the time, but thinking about our professional sector, which actually is often the arts, and they've been suffering this year, and that's a science communication problem. That's another one of my soapboxes.
So, I mean, how do we get this message out?
Well, we're communicators. I mean, what we do is we think about our audiences, our purposes for communication. You know,
we've seen communicators in a room together. We're terrible at talking to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we need to think about again as ASC, because the more we're able to demonstrate our benefit as a member organisation, and the more we're able to give back to our members, the more members join, and the more collective impact we can have when we're telling these stories, whether it's to the politicians who are making these decisions or to the public. I really want us to have a voice. You know, I don't want us to just be amplifying the voice of the research sector. I want us to be amplifying the voice of the science communication sector. And while that might not be direct lobbying, that can certainly be communicating to lobby groups, you know, even if we don't have the capacity to necessarily lobby or be an advocacy group in and of ourselves. We can certainly talk to a lot of other groups who do that. So yeah, I think we really need to think about our strategic goals, and I would hope that one of them is a thriving Cycom sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I know for a fact, you know, Australian Science Communicators definitely does care about the sector. I mean, that's how we started. So yeah,
totally.
Absolutely. To our attendees, don't forget, we've got about 10 minutes left, so do pop your questions in the Q&A little pop out. One that we've got from somebody in terms of career advice, it's often said that career mentors are very helpful. So do you have any Cycom mentors, and do you have any tips on developing these, especially in Cycom, mentor-mentee relationships?
Do you know what? I think in my space, this intersect of science and TV, that's been really hard to have. And I've seen other people like Ray Johnson, who is, you know, she's a tech journalist and reporter on NITV and has been on other channels as well. She was only tweeting, you know, in the past few weeks about how she's never been able to have a mentor, even as someone like that, and she's never been able to cultivate that in a formal sense. Whilst she has peer mentors, which I think is the same as me. And then I've even seen, you know, Yasmin Abdul-Majid, who is a woman in engineering, say something similar on Twitter only last week. So I think I don't know, as far as someone in my position, where my mentor-mentee relationships come from. But the one place I've been going the last few years has been the World Congress of Science and Factual Producers. And I think whatever area you're in, going to the conference, ASC conference, get along, whenever the next one is. I think going to conferences and networking events like that can be a good place for that. And that would be my main advice, because I've ended up with more like an informal kind of rabble of people who sometimes share information with each other, as opposed to anything formal and effective and ongoing as far as mentor and mentee relationships. So yeah, if anyone else has got advice, let me know.
Do you think these particular women that you mentioned, who are very accomplished and you know, themselves and experienced, do you think it's because they don't, why, do you know any ideas of why it is that they haven't been able to find somebody that they've felt appropriate as a mentor? Or do you have any experience, any thoughts on that, your experience?
I think one problem is, like, when I started on Scope, for instance, I was only 6 months out of my master's. Like, yes, I'd been working and studying for like 6 years before that, but Scope was my first permanent full-time job, and I was hosting a TV show. But I think when you're hosting a TV show, people assume you don't need help. And so even when you apply for things, you don't qualify and they don't let you in. And so there's actually not that much. There's a lot of opportunities for mentoring relationships that are more like strict media or strict science research, things like that. But I think, unfortunately, you know, when you're a public-facing person, people overestimate how much support and how much mentorship and things you actually have.
Yeah, and you have both that, it's like that paradox, we have too much and too little experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. I was just like, oh, well, I'm early career, but very alone here. I'm just a token sciencey person amongst the TV people.
Okay.
Yeah.
I might jump on to one of the other questions. Do you have any advice on how you've personally attracted your own science communication opportunities? The person asking the question is really interested in having more opportunities to speak, be part of panel discussions, public presentations, so on. But what is the best way to actually go about this, especially now with the pandemic and less things happening in person?
Yeah, I think for me, it's been through being visible on social media. If I tracked a lot of the opportunities I get, even the ones that come into my inbox, it is usually because the person has been aware of what I'm doing or what I'm involved in, or that I've gone freelance even, or whatever it is, because I've been visible on social media. So that's LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I've had opportunities on all of them. You don't have to have all of them or focus on all of them, but being visible about what you're up to. But also I've had to be really visible this year about the fact that I am now open for business, about the fact that these are the types of opportunities I want. Like, I've had to say, hey, everyone, if you need blah, 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 blah. But the other thing is, I think we do have a problem in Cycom when it comes to public speaking and panel discussions and public presentations, where, and I noticed this on Scope when we're looking for people, you know, the same people get put forward all the time. And then this year, because I've come to this like critical point, I was like so busy in National Science Week. And then I was like, why am I so busy? There are so many awesome science communicators. I shouldn't be saying yes to all these things. People shouldn't be asking me. I should be giving them a list of other people to go to. And so one thing I did leading up to National Science Week this this year is I just put a call out and said, you know, particularly if you're someone who's, you know, from a marginalized group in science, if you're into Cycom and you want these types of opportunities, tell me if you want only paid, unpaid, whatever, I'll put you in my list. And so I think finding people like that as well, like people you know who get those opportunities and saying, hey, the next time you can't do one, or if there's something that's not interesting to you, or even if you've just had too many, like chuck one my way. Because the thing is, I would have loved if some of the blokes in Cycom had chucked me anything for the first few years. They never did. They never did. I had to generate all my own. But I don't think everyone should have to do that because it's very lonely.
Yeah, and no, I've definitely personally found it very useful to have an advocate. And actually, even just saying that, like, hey, if you see something that I'd be perfect for, can you help me get it or let me get it? And actually verbalizing that and actually...
And it can be two-way too. Yeah. Like some of the people in your network might be like, actually, yeah, I've been thinking about something you do. Could I do one of those? Like, yeah. Because sometimes it's not just about saying yes or saying no. It's about saying, no, I can't. But if you'd like recommendations, here are some people. I mean, as long as you're seeking, you know, consent from those people to share their details with people and you know, that sort of stuff. I think that's a good way. Finding your advocate is a good way. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. I completely agree. Do you have any specific tips on things now that kind of in-person networking you mentioned social media? Is there anything else that you recommend?
Well, I have to give the Southeast Queensland ASC branch a plug because one thing I have loved, you know, I was in Canberra before, as you mentioned, and, you know, you've got your ASC branch and there's CSIRO and there's all the academies and there's Questacon and there's ANU with
Canberra's quite special for Cycom.
Yeah, it's like you're constantly in a Cycom networking event. But then moving to Brisbane, I was like, what is Brisbane Cycom? And I actually found that joining the Brisbane ASC was a really nice way to get to know who's out there here because it looks very different in each city and state, you know, what Cycom's there. And you may not know until you actually go along to one of the events. So I've been trying to get more involved in my branch. And I'd be saying this even if this wasn't an ASC event. But yeah, that's another one of the opportunities apart from social media is actually going there and you get to meet each other. You already have stuff in common because you're science communicators. And then you get to say, what are you into? What am I into? Like, oh, do you know anyone in this space? Yeah.
And it's probably a really cool time to point out both the ACT branch and the Southeast Queensland branch and a few other branches around the country as well. We're actually continuing our networking opportunities and events with, as you know, local restrictions allow, with both in-person and a lot of virtual opportunities as well.
Yeah.
And that leads us really nicely into what I think will be our last question for the day from Melanie Ward, who asks, what professional organisations or other conferences do you suggest apart from ASC, because we all know ASC does have quite a lot and we've mentioned them a bit, but are there any other recommendations that you have?
Yeah, I mean, if you are someone who's more into the writing side of things and journalism, yes, there are lots of different like generalist media and journalism organisations. There's also the Science Journalism Association of Australia, which only formed last year. You can join that as an associate as well if you're not someone who's necessarily a writer, but you're kind of in that media-ish space. There's also, you can go along to a lot of things, like if you follow the academies and what they're up to. I think when it comes to Cycom, there's a lot of science journalism and science film and TV and natural. Sometimes things aren't called Cycom, but they're kind of in amongst things. So sometimes you have to go, oh, okay, this is actually called a Factual Producers Conference, but they're actually making some content that's about science. Or, oh, this is called an Educators Conference or a Technology Educators Conference, but it's actually got a lot of stuff about science outreach and education in the classroom and libraries. So yeah, I think sometimes it's about, you know, getting those search skills out to be like, oh, so it's not called that. A lot of the time, yes, the things you're into won't be necessarily called Cycom, but sometimes it is to your advantage to be the Cycommer in the non-Cycom thing, to go to VidCon and be like, I'm the one YouTuber here who does science stuff, or to go to, you know, whatever it is about general education or comms and be like, my specialty is STEM. I think that's also valuable too.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's a really lovely note to end on. You know, don't forget to be creative. Thank you so much for your time, Tilly. Thank you also to everyone who's popped in today. Thank you so much. We might see you on Twitter. Australian Science Communicators tweets at AU Cycom. Lee is at Constable. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Don't forget to join Australian Science Communicators. There's a link in the chat, asc.asn.au/join. See ya.